Martin Lipset made those arguments a long time ago, more than half a century ago. And since then, there has been a great deal of research that I think has nuanced those arguments substantially, so that it's not widely viewed that economic development automatically leads to political reform. But of course, even when Seymour Martin Lipset was writing that, there was a very important exception to his argument, and that was India. India, of course, has been a democracy since it gained independence in the middle of the 20th century. It's the biggest democracy in the world. And despite persistent poverty and inequality in that country, it has managed to maintain a robust democracy. We have in Asia another example of a way in which political development and economic development don't seem to go hand in hand, and that would be the case of Singapore, which is a highly developed economy, but still an authoritarian or at least semi-authoritarian state. So I think one is hard-pressed to say that economic development automatically leads to political development, or that you need to have economic development in order to have political liberalization, a Western-style democracy. I think it's very unclear what the future political system of China will be and on what timetable a new political system will develop. I think many feel that the current system is living on borrowed time. That's not surprising, since in 1989 and then in 1991, communist systems fell first across Eastern Europe and then in the former Soviet Union. And we have today only 5 countries, and the other 4 are quite small, besides China, that consider themselves to be communist countries. So it's not surprising that there are many who've been predicting the extinction of communist regimes, but on the other hand, China has done a lot of surprising things, both politically and economically, over the past century. And so I would not hazard a prediction that at some particular stage of economic growth, China is going to democratize. I think if you asked most China specialists these days, they would be concerned about the future political stability of China, but very few of them would predict imminent democratization. And those few who have predicted a sudden collapse of the Chinese political system, like David Shambaugh, have not painted a pretty picture of what would follow that sudden collapse, but certainly not a picture of gradual political evolution in a liberal democratic fashion. So I think it's an open question. There's nothing inevitable about the future of China, either politically or economically. I did write. I co-edited a volume on grassroots political reform a number of years ago now, and at that time I was quite optimistic about the future of grassroots political reforms in China. In the 1980s, of course, China implemented village elections, not universally, but in many villages of rural China. And there were also a number of other very important grassroots political reforms. The transparency of budgets, for example. There were also experiments with intra-party democracy, with voting for party secretaries at local levels by other party members. But those really have stalled out in recent years. What we've had in the last couple of years has been a very dramatic anti-corruption campaign that is at all levels of the system, both grassroots and central, provincial, municipal, and so forth, both in the party and in the state and in business. There has been a very ruthless anti-corruption campaign, which also seems associated with a certain political agenda. But I'm afraid I feel pretty pessimistic about grassroots political reforms right at the moment. Aside from the anti-corruption campaign, I don't see much evidence that there has been great progress on that front. I think we've already seen in the last few years some very important movements based or arising out of this inequality that you mentioned between rich and poor, and inequality between not only rich and poor classes, but also richer, poorer regions of the country. We've seen a very powerful citizens movement, which was shut down, but nevertheless had an influence on state policy. It was a movement of parents who were migrants from the countryside to insist that their children should have access to education in the cities to which they had migrated, even if they lacked household registration in those cities. So it was a movement that eventually came up against state repression, and many of the leaders of the New Citizen movement were rebuked for their participation in the movement, but it did have the effect of seriously liberalizing many of the educational policies of cities around China. So we've already, I think, seen some important effects from these sorts of social movements. But if I were to predict in the future about social movements or political protests of various sorts that might have an influence on the stability of the Chinese political system, I would not expect them to come out of these economic inequalities, quite frankly. I think it's been pretty well established, somewhat ironically, since China is nominally a socialist country, it's been pretty well established that Chinese are able to tolerate a surprisingly high level of inequality. My colleague at Harvard, Professor Martin White, who is a sociologist, wrote a well-known book called The Myth of the Social Volcano in China, suggesting that it's a myth that this greater inequality is really causing social rage on the part of China. I think there's surprising tolerance